trying to separate.
Okay, now you're muted. Great. Okay, everybody hear me now? Good. Hopefully, there will not be any interference. All right, we are going to continue and explore the history of the Jews during that medieval era. It's actually fraught with a lot of horrible things that are going to be hurled against the Jewish people at this time period. And last week I had covered the Crusades, and I mentioned to you it was like a watershed moment in Jewish history, because believe you me, there was definitely anti-Semitism for hundreds of years prior to this, but certain key attacks against actually the physical, individual Jew will now be like open sesame after the Crusades. It sort of like broke some sort of a barrier prior to this. Believe you me, they viewed the Jews in very negative terms, consider them to be an alliance with the devil himself. And I'm sure here sporadically there might have been some sort of an individual attack upon a Jew, but now it was like, now we're going to be, vulnerable to being attacked in almost a semi-official capacity. And truly things are going to just become terrible. So before I will delve then into the really some great Rabbanim will come out of this time period, but I want you to understand the milieu in which they lived and existed, and that even, just irrespective of the most terrible time periods in which they lived, life did go on, and great Torah learning and scholarship flourished, during this time period. And again, just to remind you that the Rabbanim from this medieval period, they're called the Rishonim, okay? To differentiate them from later Rabbanim post 1500, who are considered the Acharonim. I'm not sure exactly what Rabbanim today are considered, but at some point somebody, I'm sure, will coin some sort of a phrase that would be appropriate for this more modern era. So what I'm going to be doing with you today, we're going to explore the various facets that anti-Semitism took in that medieval world. Now, just to a general, backtrack, picture as you will, that week after week, the priests and the churches are constantly decrying the depravity of the Jew. It is the Jew who is responsible for the murder of their God. And like this curse goes on, like ad infinitum. It's only going to be overturned officially by Pope John the 23rd, in the 20th century, in our lifetimes. But you have to understand, it's almost endemic, unfortunately, to that Christian mind, because we're talking about almost 2,000 years where they are constantly being preached that the Jew is responsible for deicide, for the murder of their God, and all sorts of other diabolical connotations are going to be applied to the persona of the Jew. Really quite terrible. So let's explore how did the policy or the attitude toward the Jew change then during, now we're going now into the 12th, and some of the things I'm going to be discussing with you also will be applicable to the 13th century. So some of these things are from the 12th and the 13th century. So first, a few little general points that we're going to cover, and then I'll get to the very specific anti-Semitic accusations that come out of the medieval period. For one thing, Jews were no longer indispensable as merchants. Remember, up until this time, we were the key people, again, because we would often engage in commerce, throughout that Mediterranean basin into the known world, and because there were Jews who were tradesmen and merchants, throughout this area, and because we had that common language of Hebrew, right? So we were the key merchants up until this time period. It's going to change now. Already during the 10th century, the Venetians, all right, I'm sure you've learned, or when you study general world history, you have learned of many key merchants that came out of Venice. Marco Polo, all right, is one of them, but there are obviously many others. They were especially active in pushing the Jews out of commerce. One of their doges even appealed to the Christians of Europe in the name of Christianity. In other words, it's always, because again, we are the minority. We are the only people existing in Europe at that time who were not Christian. And we were this stubborn group of people who refused to accept Jesus as their God. So in the name of Christianity, this is how he's going to appeal, not to trade with and through Jews. The Crusades completed this process of substituting Christian for Jewish merchants. All of a sudden now, because they've been marching all the way through Europe, all the way to the Middle East, to take back Jerusalem from the infidel Muslims. So now they're seeing what's out there and can explore and see what types of goods, can be brought back with them. And now that's why they're interested now in becoming merchants, okay, as well. On the one hand, the crusading spirit made it unsafe for Jews to be on the commercial highways. As you can imagine, oh my God, these marauding, mobs of people who ventured forth on the crusades. I mean, just in, that one, 12th century, we're talking about three major crusades. There will be more again into the 13th century. There were numerous crusades. The ones that impacted Jews the most are the earlier ones. So it now became unsafe for the Jew, right, to travel. And it also destroyed a lot of Jewish capital, right, because they couldn't engage properly in commerce. So now they're becoming, more destitute themselves. And how can they go and arrange commercial dealings if they don't have the funds to do that? And the Christians now obviously conquered for themselves a route to the east. So they didn't have to rely now exclusively or solely on the Jewish merchants. And the Jews were now reduced to the status of disliked competitors. And so that's why they're going to appeal to that is Christians will now appeal to the ruling authorities. Let's not allow any commerce, any trade to be done via the Jew. It should only be done through a proper Christian. Okay. As the Christian merchant class developed in wealth and numbers, many Jews were driven to seek other sources of livelihood. Well, how are we going to earn a living now? Okay, we cannot no longer trade freely. We can't travel freely, within Europe and engage with merchants, from other areas of the East. So what are we going to do to make a living? Agriculture was closed to them because they could have no serfs and could own no slaves. And just I had mentioned this earlier, I'll probably repeat it again another time so you understand. In the feudal system, the serf was aligned with a particular nobleman through a Christian oath. So that's why the Jews themselves could never themselves own any serfs or slaves, because they could not make this Christian oath binding upon them. Okay. Agriculture was close to them. Okay. The feudal system was a fully Christian operation. It was too late for them to become artisans because already, at this point, many of the Christians had taken over those particular fields. And there were guilds that were being formed. And the same thing in the guilds, you took a Christian oath to become a member of a particular guild. And that was the way you would become apprentice and learn a particular trade until, you were gradually graduated to the position of being your own artisan independently. The guilds refused to admit the Jews into their closed societies. And in France and Germany, the majority of Jews, what are they going to do now? They still have to earn a living. They were now turned to the petty trades, small things, selling of rags, I'm not sure even what else, but I know that that was certainly one of the occupations that they engaged in. And what other small artisanship might have been still open to them. So perhaps in a particular community, I don't know, some embroidery things perhaps were not yet taken by a Christian guild. Okay, so they allowed the Jews, to engage, in that activity. Now this will come to you. You're going to now try to understand why the Jew is always accused of this. There was one important field of economic activity which was thrown wide open to the Jews: the lending of money at interest. For centuries after the barbarian invasions, there had been no real need for money. I told you everything was a barter system. Things not grown by a landowner, not manufactured by his serfs or slaves, were obtained through barter. Extra money needed for building churches or castles or for waging wars could be borrowed at some interest from wealthy monasteries. Okay, so initially, where's the money coming from? From monasteries. That's how the noblemen or kings, would have had to rely, on money that the monks would have lent to them. When European life became more settled, human wants increased, and merchants needed capital. Okay, so now as things are becoming a little bit better established, in Europe, and now they're going to be needing money. Many more people will be, and obviously we're going to learn that it will be even a general Christian merchant. He still needs money to conduct whatever trade he wants to be engaged in. Human wants increased, and the merchants needed capital. Many Jews, now being crowded out of commerce, right, which we just discussed, by their Christian competitors, decided to use the wealth which had accumulated during the years of mercantile activity to lend it instead to princes or to Christian merchants. All right, so that's what I always used to wonder myself, well, where did they get the money that they were even lending to somebody? But they had accumulated a certain amount over the years when they could at one point trade freely. Even some churches and cathedrals were erected with money borrowed from Jews. So I guess if you go to Europe and you see those magnificent cathedrals, which are all over, just think that a lot of them were able to be built because of Jewish money. At about this time, the Catholic Church began to propagate the theory that any interest, however small, was to be considered usury. Now, obviously, we even discussed this in the Chumash, again, to a fellow Jew, that you cannot charge interest. Okay, so now the Christians are adopting this idea, and they're saying, oh, well, one Christian cannot charge interest to another. Okay, so since no Christian was to lend money to another in the hope of gain, right? You have to make a profit if you're in the money lending business. It was considered to be a grave sin, and it led to the Jews to fill in this void. All right, the Jews, this diabolical creature, who has no part of our, our pure Christian way of life. It's okay for him to lend the money with, and charge interest. The Jews thus came to be the preeminent lenders of money during the Middle Ages. And oh my God, this has been, so associated with us through the years until this very day, this accusation of we're being these terrible usurers and taking advantage of the Christian population. Now you have to all understand, well, it was a tremendous risk to lend money at this time because times were so unsettled. So that's why probably the interest rates were as high as they were, because, as I say, it was a tremendous risk on the part of the Jew to lend out this money, even noblemen going out to war. How do we know how's he going to come out? Is he going to be victorious? Every time would be the end, he would never be repaid. So that's why, as I say, the interest rates were rather high. Jews now took the place of bankers. Now, there are no real banks in these days, and they helped foster both private and public undertakings. Money in general was scarce then, and the risk in lending was quite great. Consequently, the legal rates of interest were often quite high, as I just explained, because the risk was so high. That's why they charge higher rates of interest. The church seized upon this unfortunate turn of events as proof that the Jews desired to bring misery upon their neighboring Christians. like this is all we thought about all day doing. This only added to the natural dislike of a debtor for his creditor. I mean, nobody wants to owe money to somebody. You feel it's just a natural feeling of resentment. In time when banking became a firmly established and highly respected business and its risks were not nearly so great. Now Christian bankers began to displace Jews in money lending. And then all of a sudden it became okay to charge interest. But, until the Christians started, and we're talking about later Middle Ages, all right? Remember some of the earlier ones are like the Rothschilds, all right? But believe me, there were many other individuals as well. Banking now, right? Eventually, when Christians also now became the bankers, and no longer seemed to be quite so disreputable an endeavor. But meanwhile, it's already associated in the Christian mind, those evil Jews, where they're usurers and they're trying to take advantage of us. The increased power of the kings and emperors of Christian Europe brought about another change in the position of the Jews. Jews used to be free to move wherever they liked. The king or emperor would extend to them protection wherever they went. Remember, I told you they were often considered like the king's Jews, all right? Well, later on, we'll learn about that. They were the Pope's Jews, all right, depending, on where they lived, what country, what area within a country, all right, and with whom they had to be aligned. As Jews gradually became and as a result, then the king, you so to speak, in the place of a serf and his relationship to a nobleman or to a king. So now the Jew, as they say, he's not a serf per se. He's in this, in between sort of a status. But again, we're, as if they owned us, or we are associated with this particular ruler. But there was one benefit to it, all right, was that the king or emperor would now extend to them protection wherever they went, all right? As Jews gradually became part of the rapidly growing towns where they served as money lenders, they more than anyone else remained under royal protection. I guess the cities were considered the property of the ruling king or prince or duke, or depending what part of Europe you lived in and who was the actual ruler. The Jews were more than willing to pay for it. They're like under siege, and they're surrounded by this very hostile population. So if they found a wealthy benefactor, so to speak, who under his aegis, they could live a bit more freely. So they were willing to actually be aligned with that person, and they obviously paid for it as well. Under the feudal system, every human being belonged to a certain class, and I mentioned this before, and had to have a distinct relationship to an immediate superior. The Jewish population was thus classified as a semi-serf population. Let me just see, I had written some other notes here. They were called serfs of the royal chamber, if they were aligned with a king. They were not attached to the soil as a regular serf, but instead became wards of the royal or the imperial treasury. Okay, it's just like chattel that was owned by the king. Just as the ordinary serf was expected to give part of his labor to his overlord's field and was otherwise completely in his lord's hands, so the Jew was expected to give part of his financial labor to his overlord's treasury and was otherwise completely in his power. So for this lovely privilege to be considered, a serf of the king, or perhaps if it was a nobleman, you had to pay for this. Okay. He wasn't doing it out of generosity out of his heart. He wanted, the Jews were making money. He wants and probably a pretty sizable portion of that money to go to his own personal treasury. A Jew could never move without his lord's permission. The Lord could also impose upon the Jew a tax of any amount, and it was very onerous, very often in many situations. In this way, emperors, kings, and other nobles who owned their Jews actually profited from the Jews' money lending activity. So it was like in their interest to allow this, because then they very heavily taxed the Jews well, part of this interest that you're collecting, it's not going to you personally. You're going to pay me for allowing you to do this business. I like this expression. I got this from one source that I had looked into. The Jews were like a sponge, which the nobility would use to dip into the purses of the general population and then squeeze it dry into their own. Right? So they were getting money, let's say, from whatever merchants that they, had to do. They would be paid for having lent the money, but then in turn they would have this money deposit into the king's treasury. Emperors and kings gave protection, but in return, the Jews lost their freedom of movement. And they whereas in the earlier time period, they could move. I don't know if they really moved around so much, but whatever movement they had was allowed. But once it became more established that, again, that the Jew in a particular town was aligned with a particular ruler, that's it. You could not leave the premises of that town or go anyplace else without the explicit permission of the ruling person. And they lost their freedom of movement, their right to own property, and their status as free men. I can't imagine what horrible life it must have been. But I guess look, wherever you are, you adjust. Times may be bad, but as I say, life does go on. They married, they raised children, they educated them. They did learn different types of occupations. Obviously, they had the Torah still to guide them. They went on. And they were not about to convert to Christianity, all right? This might start happening at some later dates, but in this era, primarily, I shouldn't say, we will be learning there are some people who did convert, obviously made their lives easier, but the majority for sure of Jews did not at this point. All the above factors, the church's fear of divergent opinions, right? You could only think in a certain way. And remember that Protestantism doesn't even exist. That will not be till the 1500s with Martin Luther. It is the Catholic Church. That is the one and only church in Europe. I mean, there's obviously the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is centered in Constantinople. But as far as the church in majority of Europe, it is the Catholic Church. And the Pope is the head of the church. So the church's fear of divergent opinions, Christian merchants' greed for the control of trade, and being put in the position of defenseless creditors, the nobility's greed. This all led during the 11th and 12th centuries to a most dangerous, and into we'll see the 13th, the 14th centuries, in most dangerous situation for European Jewry. If you ever try to question or understand, like how did even the Holocaust come to be? How did people turn against the Jews in such a vile way? It was hundreds, over 1,000 years, of thinking about the Jew in the most ugly of terms and descriptions. It was just almost endemic, right, to the European mind, unfortunately. Well, worldwide, wherever Jews have settled. So, meanwhile, just think, before we see whether there will be a change, in Muslim Spain, relatively, life was good for the Jews. They were definitely on a second-class basis. They were called dhimmis. They couldn't do certain things, but certainly in comparison to what was going on in the rest of Europe, they were living moderately very good, peaceful lives. It is going to change there as well, even within the Muslim rulers. Before the conquest, or before even the Christians will overtake this, the middle to southern part of Spain, which is being ruled at that point by Muslims. But certainly in the rest of Europe, things are terrible. It is the Catholic Church that is totally in control. So this will ultimately lead to a most dangerous situation for European Jewry. By the time the Third Crusade was over, at the end of the 12th century, the majority of Jews were no longer prosperous, or did they have any peace. So just picture the bulk of the Jews are really quite poor at this time. There are always, again, those few very wealthy usurers. Maybe some are still possibly engaging in trade, But, we're talking about a handful of people. The majority of them live in very poor conditions. The Jews were viewed as complete outsiders by the local population. Though they had contributed so much to civilization, they were nevertheless considered to be hostile enemies. By the end of that era, the Christians of Western and Central Europe were determined to either expel the Jews or to destroy them. They were only saved by the fact that the rulers of Europe still needed them. We became pawns, in the hands of these key leaders. If they felt they didn't need us, goodbye, leave our premises. Thus, instead of eliminating their Jewish residents all at once, they did so gradually over a long period of time. Now, some of the things that we're about to go, I'll try to place them all in the context of which century they occurred. But some of these ideas of these anti-Semitic rules that will gradually be passed, against the Jews, they were already in formation, right, in the 11th and 12th century, although some of them might not appear in concrete form until the 13th century. Okay, so let's do the first one I have here. The first outward sign of separating the Jews from the rest of the population was to enforce the wearing of a special Jewish badge. While this was originally an Islamic idea, and those of you who had learned with me last year will remember, it was officially put down in the Pact of Omar, but it had, existed for a while in the Muslim world. All non-Muslims had to wear some sort of identifying hat, and there were different colors based on whatever your religion was. So the Jews' hat was yellow. I believe, I'm trying to remember, but I think the Christians' hat was blue, the Zoroastrians was black. I mean, they had different color designations for the various religions under that huge caliphate that existed in those days. So the Christians obviously heard about this and knew about it, but thought, that's a great idea. Listen, the Jew looks just like his Christian neighbor, so how are they going to differentiate? Let's force them to wear a badge. Christian dignitaries now considered adopting such a law themselves. In 1215, this was at what's called the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III, I love those names, Innocent, I don't know how they adopted those lovely names for themselves, called that to officially adopt the regulation, all Jewish males above the age of 13, all Jewish women above the age of 11, I'm not quite sure where 11, not 12, we consider that button, so in any case, had to wear a yellow patch front and back on any garment worn outside. So like some people, obviously we all know how the Jews during the Holocaust were forced to wear that, the Jewish star with them, Jude on it, but look, it dates back, look how far back it dates in time. So from 1939, whatever they started instituting this, this starts already in 1215. That becomes, so to speak, a law on the books, right, that the Jew is to wear this special badge. And on any garment that you would wear outside. Otherwise, right, there was no way to distinguish between a Jew and a Christian. This yellow badge was to be a mark of shame and to further separate Christians from Jews. Now, some Jews circumvented this rule by paying enough into the royal treasury to gain an exemption. Like money talks, okay. So if you're a wealthy person, you could get out of being forced to wear this. I mean, I'm sure there were times that they couldn't, but at times when they were willing to accept this bribe, okay, then those particular individuals or members of their family did not have to wear the badge. Yet another law was on the books now, further separating Jews from the general population. Now, before I go into my next thing, so I did some research to find out more about that Fourth Lateran Council. So apparently, the promulgations came out in the year 1215, but apparently they had been meeting on and off for about 2 years to discuss. Well, there's a lot of heresy still going on, different groups, disagreeing with certain aspects, of Catholic doctrine. So this, council was called for to put down and then enforce, certain, church laws and rules that had to be followed or suffer, right, the consequences. All right. These are some of the things besides wearing the badge. Jews could not charge exorbitant interest. Okay, great. Jews were disqualified from holding any public office. And if a Jew had converted at some point to Christianity, he could never return back to Judaism. So these were just a few of the things. And again, the Pope was Innocent III, and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, we'll come back to him later, his name was Frederick II. Okay, let's see if I wrote anything else here. Oh yeah, bear this in mind. I think this is interesting. And Jews, apparently, you could not go out if you were a Jew during Holy Week. Holy Week, that's the week of Easter. All right. I only know a few of them. I know about Good Friday. I don't know what they call it. Black Saturday? Sunday's obviously, right? Easter, Monday. I don't know. Apparently for that entire week, a Jew. Oh, okay. Thank you, Ella. So, I had my mother grew up in Jersey City, and she went to public school. I think there were a lot of Catholics there, so she knew all these different things. But I only went to Jewish school, so I really never learned these various things. And then there was a compulsory tax that had to go to the Christian clergy. And again, as we already know, how the Jew was considered the servant or tied to a specific Christian prince. Okay, let's go on to some others. The next one is horrible and has lasted through the centuries. And I'm going to read you a little bit more about that as I go on. Let me just get to everything. Okay. The most insidious attack against the Jews came in the form of the false accusation of the blood libel. Now, apparently this had sort of been circulating for a time, but boy, now it's going to capture the imagination of the Christian world, and it's going to be widespread, and it's down to our modern age. It's still out there. I don't know that it's accused so much in Christian circles, but the Muslims have also adopted this. Okay. But, why they would do so, but this again, because they've turned so against the people.
Malka.
This accusation that Jews use the blood of Christians for ritual purposes first appeared around the time of the Second Crusade. Jews were accused of having kidnapped, tortured, and then crucified a Christian, then of drawing off his blood, distributing it among neighboring Jewish communities, and finally of using it in preparation of matzahs for Pesach. I remember when I first learned about this, I was just in a state of shock. First of all, yourself, we're always so careful, like when you shecht an animal, it has to be soaked and salted, and where would we ever use blood in any Jewish ritual? I mean, it just, I just completely, and then we'd put it in our matzahs. I mean, we have red matzahs. I mean, I couldn't believe that, but they believed it. I mean, that's the most terrible thing, that the Christians in those days actually believed. Yes.
Okay. When I taught British literature, Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
1392.
Yeah.
And the Jews were thrown out of England.
They've already been out for 100 years.
They weren't there.
Yeah.
And he wrote in the Canterbury Tales, the Nun's Priest's Tale.
Right, the prior
blood libel tale. And when I taught it to my students, they were in shock. And the whole thing is, how did Chaucer know about the Jews? They weren't even there. But it was all through tales.
Yes. Yeah, it was just part and parcel of their heritage, their folklore, and repeated year over year over year. So it's, as I say, it's down to the modern era. It does still exist in certain days, or even if they don't 100% believe it, but it just throws suspicion, aspersion upon the Jewish population that we would even stoop to do such things. So really, it's just the most unfortunate. So I just read a little thing. All right. Oh, then eventually the martyr. So if they found and it usually was like a Jewish child, very often male, but could have been female, that then, they would find his body, which was probably tortured or murdered, by other Christians. It had nothing to do with a Jew. I mean, we're not so, that's, we would, Ten Commandments, we would never, it would not be a permitted action to kill another human being. That's what I'm saying. So the body would often then come back to a particular church, monastery, be buried there, okay? And it would be raised to sainthood, all right? And then the attack upon the Jews. Now, the first one that occurred, so interesting, because, Ellen just made reference to Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. The first one, I mean, that's recorded in history. I don't know, perhaps some of these things did occur in early day, but the first one that, as I say, that became publicized and known was in the year 1144 in Norwich, England. And I've looked up on the map of England. And, we had talked about that in that third crusade, that's going to be afterwards, all right? There was a thing in York, in Clifford's Tower, the Jews had gone there and then they all committed suicide so that they wouldn't be attacked and murdered by the mob. But that was at a later date. That's 1189, Third Crusade. This is occurring earlier, okay? So this is closer to the time period of around the time period of the Second Crusade. And here it is. Well, can you see? I don't know. Can you see on the map? I circled it, okay? And that is where Norwich is located. And I found in another source, apparently then the account was written down by this monk, Thomas. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of read you a little bit so you can see what it was like. So first, just a little background. It was Good Friday, March 24th, 1144, and a man claimed to come across a group of Jews carrying something. After touching it, he believed it to be a human body. The next morning, a forester discovered a boy's body which showed evidence of torture. He told a priest who convinced, this forester, so then he goes and found, I saw this body of a boy hanging in the forest. He told a priest who convinced him to wait until Monday, the day after Easter, to bury the body. But the rumors quickly spread, and the Christians in the area threatened to kill all the local Jews. John, the sheriff of Norwich, not Sherwood Forest, but protected the Jews and refused to let the situation get out of hand. The local monastery and cathedral in Norwich took the child's body and soon became a great attraction for pilgrims wishing to see the remains of the martyred William of Norwich. I guess you could still go there nowadays and see some sort of memorial to this. 2 years after the supposed ritual murder, William Turville, who was the bishop of Norwich, asked Thomas to write down the details of what was quickly becoming a legend. The monk recorded the tale told to him by some of the local inhabitants. And it obviously is a mixture of some fictional, things, and then like an interpretation of what was really happening. It says the villagers in and around Norwich were astonished by the crime. But they knew almost instinctively the Jews were the culprits. Because again, I told you, it's already in the mind of the, Christian down to the most lowly serf even, that, the Jew, he's in alignment with the devil. He's responsible, right, for the killing of our Lord. And therefore, it's like open sesame for a Jew to murder any Jew whatsoever. It could only have been the Jews who would have wrought such a deed, especially at such a time. So, and then this article talks about the fact that they feel that the rumor about Jews and ritual murder and Easter, because again, the Pesach's around that, the same time period of Easter, that already had been in circulation. It wasn't like it all of a sudden, just came to the fore. Actually, when Thomas wrote down his account, he says it happened on a day when it was not the custom for Jews to leave their homes. Now, no Jewish holiday fell on that specific date. Obviously, Pesach does not always fall when it's Easter. So why would the Jews have been inside? Okay. Remember what I told you about that Fourth Lateran Council? That's going to come at a later date. That's 1215. This is 1144. But the idea, Jews should not be out during that Holy Week. All right. It says Good Friday was the reason the Jews had sequestered themselves. Yearly, during the entire week before Easter, Christians heard about Jesus' death on the cross and how the Jews betrayed him and murdered him. Anti-Jewish feeling was always at its highest at this time. The Jews probably did remain behind locked doors to escape physical attacks by Christians whose passions were always stirred during Holy Week. Just, it's horrifying to read this and then to believe that this, this accusation, this false accusation and against the Jew, it's just going to continue, be repeated over and over, century by century. I mean, the last most famous case was actually in the 20th century. I remember being appalled when I learned that actually in Messina, New York, which is like in the Adirondack area, close sort of to the Canadian border, in the, I forget now the year, but it was in the 1920s or 1930s, there was a case of ritual murder brought against the Jews because I think a Christian girl had gone missing. And look at their minds, this Christian mindset. It's the Jews. They took her, and they murdered her and they're going to use her blood for ritual purposes. So, it's out there, unfortunately. Once something, like escapes, you get back, unfortunately. So that's one of the major false accusations against the Jews that's going to come out of this medieval period, and it is the blood libel. All right, let me go back and continue. All right.
There was also even just not so long ago, the Mendel Bayless blood libel.
No, but that was the earlier time period, but in the 20th century. So the first one, as I mentioned, was in 1144 in Norwich, England, and then again it's going to rear its head in the year 1171 in Blois, B-L-O-I-S, France, and it resulted at that point. Now you see what happened in Norwich is. So the bishop or the sheriff came to the defense of the Jews. The Jews were actually in the end not attacked or put to death at that point. But in France, already in 1171, it did result in the destruction of that entire Jewish community. And it soon became an almost annual occurrence in Germany toward the end of the 13th century, in spite of the attempts of even some Christians to refute it. I'm going to mention some, and some of these were rulers, or even sometimes the Pope. Didn't make any difference because they had captured, the imagination of the local population, who were by and large pretty ignorant. Didn't matter what somebody told you; they'd already been told and learned about this now for 100, 200 years. So just because someone tells them it's not true, oh no, but I heard from so and so, my father or my grandfather,
heard it from the priest. Right.
Yeah, very, very sad, horrible. Okay, in 1236, the enlightened Emperor Frederick II, remember he's the one who worked on that Lateran Council, but he didn't really like the Pope. We'll learn more about that later. Called a conference of learned Jewish converts to Christianity to testify the accusation was a lie. But why would they believe them? They were really originally Jews, so they're probably suspects in any case in the minds of people then. And several years later, Pope Innocent IV, I love that name, issued a bull in which he announced that the accusation was not to be believed, all to no avail. I mean, even the fact that John the 23rd said, "I'm no longer guilty," right, in this day and age for having killed Jesus. I mean, it's out there. They still believe it. The blood libel accusation had caught the imagination of the common people and could not be eradicated. Okay, here's another one where I remember learning about this and I couldn't believe this one either. Another charge believed from the 13th century, so a little later time period onwards, was that of host desecration. Now, this was already brought up in that latter council that I mentioned in the year 1215, which stated that, I think it's if you're calling when you take communion. So, I've never been in the Catholic Church to observe this, but there's a service, and afterwards you go up and you're supposed to, they give you like a little wafer. I mean, this is what nowadays, I don't want to look like then, years ago. And you were to eat that. And then you were also to take a sip of wine. And this Lateran Council said that, in fact, it's as if you were able to taste like from the body of Christ and his blood. All right. So, but they believe that this was real, that it's called transubstantiation, that it becomes the body and the blood of Jesus. This was a belief, right? The wafer used during communion, which Catholics believe actually turned into the body of Christ upon consumption, was stolen by the Jews to be used in secret ceremonies of torture. And I've seen their paintings and lithographs, showing this, whereby the Jews would repeatedly stab the wafer in the belief that Jesus' blood would then flow freely in a reenacted crucifixion. I mean, can you imagine? As if we didn't have enough things to keep us busy. And we were trying to make a living, raise our families, conduct our life. That's all we had to do, is get these little wafers and take, I don't know, what a needle or a knife and puncture holes, as if, so we believe too that it's now the body, the actual body, and we can reenact the crucifixion. That's what they were saying. For Christians, this calumny was utterly blasphemous. Oh my God, what a terrible thing. And they believe that this is what the Jews did, as if we had nothing else to do but stab their little wafers. For this too, the Jews were killed and their property was taken away. I think it was just a good excuse, actually, to enrich themselves. Very, very sad. Eventually, the cumulative effect of all these attacks on the Jews resulted in their expulsion from the countries in which they live. Now, this is going to be a process, and you'll see sometimes it's in stages, right? Philip Augustus of France was the first to do so in the year 1182. Okay, we're talking about the 12th century. Even this is before even that third crusade. Now, again, just so you understand, in France at that time, so the king owns an area around the Ile de France, that's Paris and its environs. He didn't rule over the entire country. So when we say he's expelling, it means the Jews under his control. First, he stripped them of all the worldly possessions. Naturally, you're not going to allow us to leave, with wealth we might possibly have accumulated. Then in 1198, realizing that he could use the income which he would derive from the money lending Jews, he invited them to come back and resettle it in the very same places from which they had been originally driven. This pattern was repeat itself time after time over the next 2 centuries. By the end of this time period, Christians had learned to look upon the Jews as being untrustworthy and suspicious, and as people who could be easily brutalized. The story of the wandering Jew thus came to be true. The Jew, that was considered like a curse upon us, because we, didn't accept Jesus as our Lord. So that's why we had to wander throughout the world. The Jew had lost his sense of home and community and could no longer feel safe and secure wherever he dwelled, came into being, right? And we will ultimately be totally expelled from England. That will be in the year 1290, and eventually more widespread in France in 1394. And in Germany, what's going to happen, again, because it's divided up, it's not a unified country at all, we'd be expelled from this dukedom or this principality, and we'd go to another one, and then might eventually find our way back. So, it was a very choppy existence. And eventually, obviously, Jews will find their way back. But Jews, for example, like in England, they officially could not live there until into the mid 1600s. So we're talking about from 1290 to 1600. There obviously were some secret Jews who did make during Elizabeth's reign. Apparently, Queen Elizabeth I, her physician was a Jew. So obviously, there were Jewish people living there. So we will continue next time with learning more about what life was like for the Jew in medieval Europe, and then we will continue with, country by country, and a specific time period in greater depth. So be well, everybody. Have a good rest of this week.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you.
Be safe.
Bye. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye bye. Take care.
Nice to see you, Malka.